So that other talk is to talk about how do we take a complex piece of functionality and break it down into simple chunks, somewhat like the agile methodology, and like build complexity from like a very simple idea. So one thing I say to like at every workshop, every talk I give is I don't think there is such thing as a stupid question. When I was learning JavaScript, I had so many questions that I thought in my head were stupid. But in reality, everybody in the room was thinking the same thing. So please do not hesitate to stop me and shout out if something you don't understand, because chances are more than one person is thinking the same thing. So for those of you who do not know what World First does, we help people pay other people in different currencies. So that means we need to be able to enable transactions in 140, 150 different currencies all across the world. So that means we end up with a form, and each of those currencies has different requirements and different like legal needs that go along with them. So we end up with a form that, depending on the currency you pick, has different requirements, and you need to collect different data for different people. So here you can see a very zoomed out version of what our designers have created. There's like a couple of key things to note. Spread across 3 pages. There's some like purely visual toggles, and there's also some toggles that are programmed into the schema. And depending on how people answer certain inputs, this field changes. So as you go down, it like adapts to your input. It's quite complicated. So that form is actually generated by this schema, and this is just like a screen grab of less than a 20th of it. So this is generating the like 30 or 40 fields that makes up that form, all of which are required by law. So that's why it is so long. Honestly, I'm not expecting you to get anything from that. It's just you're meant to have the same reaction I had when I saw it for the first time, which is like, oh my God, what am I going to do with this? So yeah, form generated by a schema. Certain inputs change it. This schema is deeply nested. So like, I think at its deepest, it's about 15 levels. And like each of those levels, no, 15 levels, that's wrong, 7. 7 levels. Each of those levels has information about validation that could be required further down the schema. Our designers don't want the schema to dictate where inputs are placed on the field. They want them to go in a particular order. Obviously, they want it spread out across 3 pages. And there are multiple different ways that you can display data. So I actually have spent a lot of my career at startups. And I imagine most of you are like really familiar with this idea. The idea of, rather than just like going straight to the end state, you slowly build your way up. And this is the way I personally think like a lot about development, rather than like building the wheel and then look at the graph. I think about like, what is the smallest functional piece that we can build? And then how do we build upon that functionality to create something that eventually ends up rendering that form in the way our designers would like? So it's like, how do we break things down and then build upon what we have broken down to create the car? All right, I don't expect you to read this. I actually have it in another tab. So like, the first step for me when I see that form is, let's build a text field, which is what we have here. Can people see that okay up the back? Or does it need to be bigger? Sweet. So this is just like a really simple version of this. This path field, you'll notice, is very long. And that is going down all the nesting, and it's saying, target this set of properties for this field. And we are passing in the schema, which is that enormous thing you saw before. I hesitate to say this is where the magic happens, but this is our skateboard, for want of a better word. It's just like a basic input. And so we have a rename key, some rename key functionality where we go through and we transform JSON schema, that's the schema we're using, the properties in JSON schema to be more friendly in HTML. So we rewrite default to default value. Const is actually a reserved word in JavaScript. and that one took me ages to work out why it just would not work. So we renamed that to state. We renamed title to label, things like that. And then we just loop through each of those properties and rename every single one. And we pass down those properties into input. In the final version, we actually have a wrapper around input that renders the label, that provides some validation. But even here, if there were validation options here, like in JSON schema, there is a max length property, that would be passed directly into input. So we're getting some like HTML5 validation basically straight out of the box. So like what we have there is great, right? But we have to pass schema down every time. Like we have to pass schema into all of our input fields, which is kind of inconvenient. It also like greatly limits the flexibility of where we can use text input because schema has to be available. So like the next step is, how many people are familiar with like the newish context API? So for those people who are not aware, this is actually almost exactly how Redux works under the hood. But what it does is it's a way to pass arguments or properties down through multiple levels of the DOM or the JSX tree without having to manually pass them down every time. So we could say up here, we want these properties to be available to all of our children. And then lower down in the tree, which I'll go into a little bit more detail, we can say, take those properties out and use them here, which is like a really powerful idea. And a lot of libraries use it, like Redux uses it, React Router uses it. Almost any theming you see in any library uses that as well. So here we're like going to abstract out schema. We're going to put it into our context. And we're going to make it available to any child of schema context provider. So basically all we're doing is, so here I'm using user reducer, which is like another one of the new hooks. But it's basically saying, take these two values and put them into provider and make them available to any children. We're also then setting up a getter that we can use to get the state out in our children. And you'll see how that works. So you'll notice we're no longer passing in schema into our text input. And here, we're using useGetSchema. And this is how we get the schema out of that state and we use it. So like almost nothing in this text input has changed, with the exception of adding in useGetSchema, where we extract the schema that we've passed down. We're still renaming the properties. We're still passing the properties in. We're just getting the schema from a parent much further up the tree. So great. So now we can use our text input anywhere, as long as it's below schema child. So this name I've had, this is probably about the third or fourth version of these I've built. And this name has stayed with me since the beginning. I'm not sure it's the best name, but there we go. So the next idea is, this schema has multiple types. And we want the schema to be able to decide which of those types is shown. So here we have, rather than passing in a text input, we pass in an input mapper that says, based on the type, decide which of these UI elements we want to show. So same thing, we're passing in the path. The path is coming down to the input mapper. And then the input mapper is calling display field. And display field is deciding, is it a string with a one of array? Use a select input. Is it a string without a one of array? Use a string input. Is it a Boolean? Display a checkbox. Yeah, so now, basically what we've done is we've created a placeholder that says, we would like this to be displayed at this point on the page but it's up to the schema. It's up to the schema to decide what input will be shown there. And this is like a really powerful idea. Like here, I've done it all in the one component, but the input mapper can be used anywhere below schema provider, so it can be nested deeply inside any other component. And it will always display in the same location, or it'll always connect to the schema, it'll get the properties, and it'll display. Like the first thing I noticed when I saw the paths is they are really long, and the properties is repeated over and over and over and over and over again. So like, why not just take that out? And it's like every second item is a properties. So we can like strip that out, and we can create this interpolate properties, which injects properties into each, in between each element in the array or in the string. But also, because our schema was written by backend developers, and I love backend developers, and this applies to front-end developers as well, we are not the greatest at creating content. So some of the labels are worded quite interestingly. They're not that user-friendly. So we wanted to be able to overwrite the labels on the front end. So input mapper, we can pass in properties that match up, sync up with the schema. So here we're passing in a label, we're passing in a type boolean, and here we're passing in an array. And in input mapper, we just sit them in over the top. So if people are familiar with this syntax, basically it's just replacing anything that is already in properties with anything that is in overwrite. This is the final piece of code. We're now adding in a reducer, which you actually saw me adding earlier. Like the primary goal of this reducer is here. Every time somebody changes a box that refreshes the schema, we can update that schema, which then filters down to all of the components underneath and will re-render that form every time that is updated. Here, anytime somebody updates a value, it gets put into some state. And here, if, say, we wanted to edit, we could update all values. And the only real changes we need to make here is we add an onChange that is passed down to every component. Typically, I try and create functions like the onChange in the input mapper and then allow the components beneath to handle any differences. All right, so I actually had a demo of this, but in a brain fade, I put it on our company servers, which are not accessible outside of our building. So I will upload that to my GitHub and I will make it work. And I will send it to whoever organizes the meetup. And they can put it in the notes afterwards. So you guys can have a look at how this works in. But the next steps from here is, like, how will we make this better? And this is actually almost all of the functionality that we launched with yesterday. Sometimes there are required fields that we want to display, but we actually don't care what order they go in. So we can use a component to sort of track what has been rendered and what hasn't been rendered, and then just display that underneath. We can add real-time error handling. Because we're getting all that information from the schema and it's going directly into our component, if somebody enters the wrong input, we know immediately. We can implement some more advanced features of JSON schema. So like, what are the advantages of this approach? And like, to summarize exactly what we're doing here, we're saying input mapper corresponds with a properties of the schema. And we can place input mapper anywhere on the page. It's not bound by anything other than the fact that it's beneath the schema provider. So our design is not dictated to by the schema. It's dictated to by where we put the input mapper. We can use this for different schemas. As long as it adheres to JSON schema, we can use the same code and it will work. And if somebody on the back end makes a change, they change the way something's validated, they change what fields are displayed, the code will adapt to those changes. We're hiring. That's about all there is to say. If you are interested in working on some interesting problems that get delivered to the entire world, like we have customers all over Australia, China, Hong Kong, Europe, England, America. So, any questions?
It's interesting and I see that you did things to be as flexible as possible. My first question would be at this point, why did you try to reduce the complexity a bit in the backend? If it gives you a schema which is so complex, so keep it a bit more flat or a bit more structured. That was not an option for some legacy reason, or?
Yeah, excellent question. Is this working? Yes. That was my first response when I saw this schema. The challenge is this schema is used already by multiple different things, and the way our database is designed is to match those things. So if I could have, we would have simplified it, and we actually did do a little bit of simplifying, but this was like a legacy schema that we had to use, I guess. That's why we didn't simplify it.
Right, you mentioned that you have customers all over the world. So the product you launched yesterday.
Yes.
English only, or does it include internationalization? Because you didn't mention it.
Yes, all over the world, translated. So one of the advantages of using an existing schema that we had, it was already translated into a lot of languages, and because the majority of those, the titles, the labels, the fields are coming from that schema, we actually didn't have to do any work translating. We only had to translate the schema. There were a few overwrites, and because this is going into an existing piece of software that already had translations enabled, we just had to upload them into our translation software.
I can understand that the schema defines the order of the fields and the hierarchical structure of the fields, but how do you structure the style and layout? Does it also come from the backend side who is structuring the schema?
So because input mapper, basically what input mapper does is it says, where is the properties that corresponds to this path in the field, and then it takes them out. So like, the schema doesn't actually define where things sit, input mapper does. And it says, this path corresponds to this input, and it's in this location.
Okay, so it assumes that the CSS lies at some place and points towards.
Well, so actually what you can do is you can pass the CSS into input mapper, and that will style that particular component if you would like. Or we use styled components. So like a lot of our inputs are already styled when we move them in.
Okay, thanks.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I think we're probably out of time. Thank you.